Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class this week. This week's class is all about learning about national elections. So we're going to walk through some nuts and bolts about the election process, how it works. Then we'll dive deep into the Electoral College, how that works, and talk about why we have it and the vote for the president. So we have a lot to go through today, and elections are really fun. And if you didn't notice, there was a pretty big elections going on in your communities yesterday. So as you see the results coming in, and you can look up your local election office and see the data coming in, you can start putting all these pieces together to not just say, what was the vote yesterday, but how does it actually work? So we're diving, I love sharing any stats from your community in the chat. That's really fun too. But let's start diving into these big questions that I just went through. There's a lot of questions here, and there's a lot of the Constitution that has to do about voting and elections. But Tom, even though we're going to look at that Constitution and look at where elections are in the Constitution and where voting is in the Constitution, there's still a lot left to be not unknown, but really that people kind of get confused about. So as we go through this process, we have a lot written into the Constitution, and at the same time, it feels different for different people. And why is that? And we'll talk a little bit about federalism as well, which is always fun to talk about. And I swear my newest topic at every dinner conversation is I try to bring up federalism as a fun job. So let's dive into where in the Constitution you find elections. So Tom, kick us off. And everybody, as you go through today, I'm Curry and this is Tom. We'll be with you today. Ask lots of questions in the chat.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. What a great day to talk about elections in the Constitution. So let's start, as we always do, with the Constitution's text itself. And we're going to start with the original Constitution, the one that was drafted at the Constitutional Convention. If we look at the Constitution, there are a few parts in it that speak about elections. So Curry has them on the screen here. There's Article 1, Section 2, which talks about how elections will work in the U.S. House of Representatives. It sets the qualifications in those sorts of elections. Article 1, Section 3 does the same for United States senators. Article 1, Section 4 is really, really important because it tells us that the time, place, and manner of elections is generally left to state legislatures, but as a backstop, Congress has some power to also step in and regulate. And then finally, we're going to spend a lot of time on the Electoral College. It's originally written there in Article 2, Section 1. So there's all of these scattered parts of the Constitution talking about elections. But I say there are really a couple of really big takeaways, things that you want to keep in mind about the original Constitution. The first is that the original Constitution left elections and voting largely to the states. So it's a story of federalism. It's a story of state power. And that's why elections for things like state governors, state legislatures, mayors, county legislatures, town councils, school boards take place in different years, even different ways. And the Constitution leaves those decisions largely to the state and local governments. So some of your parents may have voted yesterday for instance, governor. I'm in New Jersey. And so we were electing a governor yesterday. Other parents will do it in different years. And so it's just to keep in mind that that variety there in how we conduct elections is written into the Constitution. And so some of the biggest... Governor, I'm sorry, Carrie, yes.
No, that's a great point, Tom. So like in Pennsylvania, we had no governor vote this year, but we had school board. So students, as you're thinking about it and you go home tonight, make sure you know like who was voted on this time and when's the next time that they may be voted for. So good point, Tom.
Yeah, and so it's also with that, Curry, that's why there are different rules for things like vote by mail, for when there's early voting, when there's drop-off voting. There's a variety and just the time, place, and manner of how elections are carried out. And that's what Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution tells us. Again, it's that states play a really, really big role in defining how elections are going to take place. The other big thing to keep in mind is that the original Constitution creates different election timetables for different parts of the national government. So members of the U.S. House of Representatives, they're elected every 2 years. Members of the Senate they serve for 6 years, which with a third of the Senate up at any given time. And the president's elected every 4 years. So the president's term is somewhere between those in the U.S. House, which is the shortest, the 2 years, or the U.S. Senate, which is 6 years, or the longest. And so, Curry, there's the sort of the two things you see there. One, so many of these decisions left to the states. And so different states have different offices even being elected each year and different rules for things like how to vote. And the other is that we have these different timetables for different parts of the national government, for the U.S. House the US Senate, and the presidency, all written into the Constitution.
And that's really helpful because the one of the students put it out in the chat that like the turnout was different because there wasn't actually a lot of people on the ballot in their community. So it changes how many people go out for it too. So all these things all connect the dots. And that, you know, because it's left up to the local areas in the states, that federalism, things change for different people. So that's really helpful and makes sense of why people don't just have like one answer for the way it works and how this works in our state, in our counties. And it makes it a little bit trickier to put your finger on the really simple formula of how elections work. Now, as we spell out how elections work and where they are in the Constitution, the other side of that coin is where is voting rights in the Constitution? And I know we have a whole class on voting in the Constitution, but for this class, since they really are so tightly connected, and Uriel just pointed out something about electing senators, I thought it would be really helpful to walk through some of these big amendments that have to deal with voting in the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. So the original Constitution says certain things about voting, but what we see is if we look at the 27 amendments added to the Constitution over time, a lot of them have to do with voting and elections in certain ways. So you can see the amendments here. We have the 12th Amendment, which alters the Electoral College. We have the 14th Amendment, which provides a mechanism for penalizing states when they deny African-American men access to the ballot box. And the Supreme Court has also used the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to protect voting in certain ways. The 15th Amendment bans racial discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment provides for the popular election of US senators. Under the original Constitution, senators were elected by the state legislatures. The 17th Amendment sets up the system we have today, where we, the people, vote for our senators. The 19th Amendment bans sex discrimination in voting. The 23rd Amendment brings the Washington, D.C. voters into the presidential election contest, granting them 3 votes in the Electoral College. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in national elections. So this is attacking one of those forms of Jim Crow discrimination against African Americans. And then finally, the 26th Amendment protects the voting rights for those 18 and older. And so we see here, Curry, if the big takeaways of this list that we have here are that several amendments extend voting rights protections to different groups. So based on race with the 15th Amendment, sex with the 19th Amendment, age with the 26th Amendment. Furthermore, some of these amendments grant new powers to the national government to help protect voting rights and define voting rights in certain contexts. And so we see enforcement clauses in the 15th, 19th, 26th Amendment. So it's rebalancing that system of federalism, giving the national government a bit more power and taking some of that power from the states. And it's through these powers that Congress passes big laws, like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which attacked racial discrimination in voting. And the last point is that we see a new role for voters in certain elections in a couple of these, with the 17th Amendment bringing voters into Senate contests, and the 23rd Amendment bringing Washington, D.C. voters into presidential elections.
And Tom, thank you for pointing that out. So it is this idea that the system of who, you know, we're going to leave it up to the states to figure out exactly how to do this, but we're going to put big principles into the Constitution with these amendments to say how you cannot deny it and what voting clarity is needed as a big overarching system. But you pointed out the act, so like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so there's other actions that play into this. So thank you for kind of giving all those layers through how we see elections and the right to vote and the action of voting as well. And all these things are connected. We have a super complicated system. It's super interesting though, like it was really fun to talk about this, and it's super complicated. And I don't mean that to say like it's complicated is bad. Complicated can be very good at times, but let's dive into it, because what we hear all the time is, should we keep the Electoral College? And before we dive into answering that question and looking at the two different sides of it, let's begin with, how does the system to vote for the president in the Electoral College work? And then we'll dive into why did they set it up that way? And then we can kind of come back to this question and answer it. But elections overall in our country are really specific and unique and special, and that gives a lot of control to the local people to understand how to run their local elections, but ensures that big principles are still in our Constitution and that everybody will align under them. So it's a complicated but amazing system. And let's dive into the next subsystem within that system, the Electoral College. So tell us more about how this works.
So yes, the Electoral College is the system that we use to select our president. So today, the Electoral College, it's made up of 538 electors drawn from states and the District of Columbia. How do we get the number of electors? Well, under Article 2 of the Constitution, it tells us that states are given the number of electors equal to the number of members of Congress that they have. So if your state, say, has 2 members in the US House of Representatives and 2 United States senators, you would then have 4 electors in the Electoral College. And as we said, the 23rd Amendment also gives the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes. Today, people vote for president and vice president on election day, but technically speaking, they're not voting directly to determine the outcome of the election. Technically, these popular votes determine which electors will be appointed to the Electoral College. So these electors actually meet, they physically meet in December to cast their votes for president and vice president. I love that. I love that image where it's sort of a bunch of voters voting the first time. That then determines that middle category, the electors, which meet in December. Then it's those electors that determine technically who is president. And if a candidate receives a majority of these votes in the Electoral College, that candidate wins, even if they don't win the national popular vote. But if no candidate secures an Electoral College majority, then the election is sent to Congress. It's sent to the US House of Representatives, voting as states, not as individuals, to select the president. This happened, for instance, in 1824 in the election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. We're looking at the Electoral College itself, this body of electors that's meeting in that December. It's not as though there's usually a lot of discussion about who the president should be. It's not really a deliberative body. They do physically meet in state capitals, but usually they're appointed mechanically by the states based on the popular votes cast in that state on election day. So under Article 2, the actual electors themselves, they're appointed to rules that are set by the state legislatures in each state. So again, the Constitution with Article 2 is telling us states have a great deal of discretion to determine how they're going to select their electors. So we've seen a great deal of variety and change over time in how electors are selected. But today, 48 states appoint their electors in the same way. They appoint them on a winner-take-all basis, provided, and they're based on whichever party's candidate wins that state's popular vote. And so it's really, you really are having a pretty direct connection between who's winning the popular vote in, say, California here. You can win by 1 vote. You could win by 1 vote in the popular vote in California. You get all of its electoral votes, 54. So that's the winner-take-all system. That's 48 states in the District of Columbia. That's how they do it. But 2 states do take advantage of their powers under Article 2 to have a different system. These are Maine and Nebraska. And so they award electors by congressional district, and they give their remaining 2 electoral votes to the statewide vote winner. And so you see more of a division here where it's based on, one, you're getting a set of votes based on if you win the congressional district, and then if you win statewide, you get an extra 2. I think, Curry, if we're looking at sort of like how has the Electoral College worked over time, I'd say what you'd see really from almost the very beginning is a move towards making the presidential election process more democratic and having the popular vote have more say over who the electors are going to be over time. But again, it's important to remember that Article 2 is giving states a great deal of discretion to choose how they're going to select electors for president.
And that's really helpful. Tag brings up in the questions with the idea, a story of federalism, how could we change the Electoral College without adding an amendment? And when you were talking about the states kind of changing how they count the votes, so almost like working with the Electoral College, but changing how the voting is divvied up. That's some way to answer that question. So if you decided that you didn't want to change the Electoral College and didn't want to amend the Constitution, one way you could affect change in the Electoral College choosing of the president is doing something like Nebraska and Maine did, and not California, not winner takes all.
That's right. So states have a great deal of discretion to choose to do things like that, for sure.
Good. Okay, good. It was just, we were trying to think of all these different ways to affect change or keep it stable, and we were diving into it already in there. So Tom, when we think about kind of this process and understanding not just how it works, there's so much of the questions, and I think Uriel said it in the chat, like it's really complicated, and I think it's too complicated. So let's go back to the Constitutional Convention. Let's start 1787 in May, and thinking about not just how to pick a presidency, but what does he want to put in the presidency, to say, here's what a president does, this is how we're going to vote for a president, and how do they come up with this system in the first place?
Yeah, so of all of the things that the delegates are choosing to do at the Constitutional Convention, the presidency was one of the toughest problems for them. And part of the reason is, when they're looking to create the Constitution, they were trying to look for examples in their own world or in history to try to figure out, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And they really couldn't find exactly the sort of person like the president that they wanted to create. So they looked to Europe and they saw powerful kings, and they didn't want that. We had King George III. No, we're not going to do that anymore. But also they looked at their own state constitutions that existed at the time, and the governors were really, really weak, and the state legislatures were really, really strong. And many of the delegates thought that didn't get the balance right either. And so the delegates debate, and there are wide-ranging views as to what the president should be. You have delegates like Alexander Hamilton, who, in fact, even liked the limited monarchy of Great Britain a bit, but certainly wanted a single strong president, someone that was independent of the legislature, independent of Congress. But on the flip side, you also had people like Connecticut's Roger Sherman, who was a really important delegate, who really wanted a weak president and a strong Congress, really just wanted a president who was going to carry out the commands. So you see these battles between the delegates, and over time they're going back and forth on a range of issues. One of them is how to select the president, but there are a few different issues that together they debate. And what they notice is that they debate these big four issues. Their views change over time, and it changes how they think about the other ones. And so this becomes a really tough problem defining the presidency. They debate how to elect the president, how long the president should serve, whether the president should be able to run for re-election, then the question of impeachment and removal if the president abuses his power. And so, again, the delegates go back and forth. And so the creation of the presidency is a great challenge for them. And they really, really struggled with that in determine how to elect a president. And so if we just look at the debates, Curry, they came up with a lot of different ideas. They said, some delegates, like Pennsylvania's James Wilson, said, let's use a direct popular vote. Let's cut out the middleman. Let's have a direct popular vote. For Wilson, this was a great idea because it was rooted in the deep principle of the Constitution of popular sovereignty, ruled by we the people. But some delegates said, no, that's going too far, Mr. Wilson, for a couple of different reasons. Some delegates were just elitists. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts is an example, and he just thought, for instance, that the people, they weren't up to the task. They weren't basically. They weren't up to the task of selecting a president. But there were others, like George Mason of Virginia, who said, it's not so much that I don't think people could figure out who to elect for president, but it's just that we have a really, really big country. People really only know people in their own community, maybe in their own state. And so it's just asking too much of people to know who the great leaders of the country are outside of their state. So the idea being that, sure, the first election is going to work. Everyone knows George Washington. Everyone loves George Washington. But after George Washington, we're not going to have any other George Washingtons. And so a direct popular vote isn't going to work. So that's James Wilson's idea. Many, many delegates voted for the idea of having Congress select the president. And so at different times in the convention, a majority of the delegates said, yeah, let's go with the congressional vote. The advantage of this is members of Congress, they're people like us. They're really smart. They're the best and the brightest of society is what the delegates are saying. So of course we should select who the president is. But then we have folks like Gouverneur Morris here, you see of Pennsylvania, who said, no, I know what we're like. We're going to get into a back room. We're going to deal. And we can't trust ourselves. The presidency is then going to be the work of what he says of intrigue, of cabal, of faction. The idea is that if Congress is going to select the president is then going to be beholden to Congress. And what we've learned from the state constitutions is we want a president that's stronger and more independent than that. And so delegates go back and forth. They can't figure out what to do until finally they broker a compromise known as what we have today, the Electoral College. And it's not to say there weren't criticisms of this system. So the Electoral College, they looked to that and they said, the advantages are obvious. We can sort of have an additional body that's out there that's not Congress, but a body of national elites who can sit there and select a president. And so, you have a president that is then independent of Congress, but you have a body that's selecting the president. And so it gives us something like what we're getting, the benefits of the congressional election, but instead in this separate body. But the critics said a couple of different things. One was, how are we going to do this? We're a big country. People don't really leave their towns very much. It's going to be expensive. Seems like it's going to be a really complicated system in a practical sense. And then the other part of it was, people like George Mason said, are we even going to really be able to put good people in the Electoral College? We're going to be serving in Congress. The best and the brightest, we're going to be in Congress, we're going to be in government. Who are going to be these people sitting in the Electoral College, and why in the world should we trust them? So the delegates in the end select the Electoral College. For people like Wilson supporting the direct popular vote said, this is probably the closest I'm going to get to direct popular vote, the Electoral College. Will give the states the power to select electors. And what I predict is that over time, that more states are going to give voters more say in the presidency, and we're going to get closer and closer to a direct popular vote. And in fact, that's what we see through history, is voters having more and more say over who the president's going to be. And for those who supported congressional selection, they thought, with the Electoral College, if someone gets a majority of the vote, like George Washington in the Electoral College, they become president. But after Washington, no one's really going to have the national reputation to get a majority in the Electoral College. So in the system that we're putting in place, if there's no majority in the Electoral College, it goes back to Congress anyway. And so we get congressional election in most cases, is the prediction they make. George Mason said 19 times out of 20, the president's going to be selected by the US House of Representatives. Now, that may look ridiculous to us now because that's not how it played out, but it wasn't at all a ridiculous prediction at the time. And so that's the compromise, Curry. It ends up being a complicated system, but it's born of this compromise between some people pushing for popular election of president and some people pushing for congressional selection.
Got it. So they're taking ideas, they're trying to marry it together and trying to put safeguards in. But when we think about, I love that Gouverneur Morris, who as you read, you realize he's extremely elite and snobby, but he recognizes that in himself and his peers. So it's funny that they do create a system that still is very elite, that it's only going to be a few, it's going to be people able to travel and do this work. But like you said, Tom, it's a compromise to try to say, here's some way, we're not ready to do a direct popular vote. Wilson wanted it to lead that in that direction, but it really has a few checks and balances. Some of those that never happen. So it never really goes to Congress, or doesn't often go to Congress. And pretty quickly, it's not working right. So the Electoral College system is put into play. And in the first few elections, it's tested after Washington, of course. So these are some of my favorite stories in election intrigue and storytelling. So tell us the election of 1788 and 1792 and how we see that Electoral College being tested and then having to be changed.
Yeah, so one of the first amendments to the Constitution is altering the Electoral College, the 12th Amendment, which we'll get to in a second. But remember, under the original Constitution, the electors are casting ballots for not one person for president, but for two. And the second place person will then become the vice president. The first place person will become the president. So the framers didn't expect us to have political parties. They really expected it to be sort of a free-for-all where the person with the biggest reputation, the person who was most respected, would be elected president in that case. However, political parties emerged very quickly. So you're right, Curry, 1788, 1792, we have George Washington running for president. And we notice that things work well when Washington runs for president. George Washington, every single elector cast their vote for George Washington. He remains the only candidate that's elected unanimously by the Electoral College. And John Adams gets a substantial number of votes as well, and he becomes the vice president. But quickly, by the election of 1796, this system already begins to break down. We have two of the founders squaring off against each other in this election. John Adams against Thomas Jefferson, the vice president, against the Secretary of State. I think Jeff Rosen, our president, often calls them their frenemies, the frenemies of the founding generation. But already we're seeing political parties emerge. John Adams, affiliated with the Federalists, Thomas Jefferson, affiliated with the Democratic Republicans. And so Adams actually wins this election in the Electoral College, but it's a fairly close race. And so Adams gets the most number of votes, but the second votes, the other Federalists, the votes are so scattered that the second place finisher is Thomas Jefferson. And so under the original Constitution, the first place winner, John Adams, becomes president, but his vice president is Thomas Jefferson, his political opponent, the figure, the leader of the opposing political party. So just to put this in our own context, imagine Hillary Clinton being Donald Trump's vice president and Donald Trump being Joe Biden's vice president. This system didn't work very well. It was extremely awkward in 1796.
I love that. Awkward.
yeah, I was trying to choose the right word, but it really, and that's what it is. And so we have this. So we have this happen in 1796. 1800, we run into even bigger problems than that. So they run, there's a rematch. It's John Adams, the sitting president, against Thomas Jefferson, the opponent there. This time Jefferson wins in yet another really close race. And so, Curry, this is, on one hand, this is a really, really important moment. We set a really important precedent for American democracy where we see a sitting president lose and hand over power to someone else and a figure affiliated with the other party. So we see the peaceful transition of power. But a lot happens before then. And it's because Thomas Jefferson actually ends up tying his running mate, Aaron Burr, in the Electoral College. They both get 73 electoral votes. Now, everyone knows Thomas Jefferson, in this case, is supposed to be president, and Aaron Burr is supposed to be vice president, but Aaron Burr decides, I'm going to game the system. You know, the rules in place, I could possibly win here. And so the election in this tie goes to the US House of Representatives. So who's in the US House of Representatives? It's the Federalists who just lost the election. So those Federalists, the opposite party, have to decide between their political opponent, Thomas Jefferson, and their political opponent, Aaron Burr. And so there's a ton of ballots. There's balloting in the House of Representatives that lasts 6 days, 36 ballots. We have Jeffersonian governors in Pennsylvania and Virginia threatening to call up the state militia and make sure that Jefferson becomes president. There's a real threat of violence, but cooler heads prevail. Leading Federalists, notably Federalists outside of Congress, like Alexander Hamilton, reached the conclusion that Thomas Jefferson's the lesser of two evils here. They convince a bunch of Federalists in the House of Representatives, no, either abstain or vote for Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson ultimately wins, and he's peacefully inaugurated. But we decide very quickly, this system isn't working very well. We need to figure out a way to adjust it in certain ways to recognize the fact we're going to have political parties. And so very quickly, we move to amend the Constitution with the 12th Amendment, and we look to iron out some of the bugs in that original system. We want to avoid the real possibility of ties, and we also want to really make sure that the president and the vice president are going to usually come from the same party. The big change is that the electors still get 2 votes, but 1 vote goes specifically for president and 1 vote goes specifically for vice president. And so this is really trying to avoid that problem of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr from the same party getting the same number of votes, resulting in conflict between the 2 of them.
I always think this is such, I mean, it's such a soap opera-y, crazy story. But it's also really interesting, and just watching kind of the testing of the guardrails of the Constitution during this process, and then they didn't foresee this idea of how would political parties play into this. I also think it's really interesting that you have a peaceful transition of power from Adams to Jefferson, but it's within their own team that you see an unpeaceful kind of process of power through this system. And it is really heightened. I mean, it is so heightened and so awkward, is what we said in the chat. It's so unbelievably awkward that we get a 12th Amendment added. And we really kind of look through that process and say, how is this working? Is it working the way that they had intended it? And how does it kind of, what is that question today? And one of our student classes, Hall's class, has that question, but I want to go do a couple more things and then go to their question about the process today. So can you kind of walk us through these 5 elections? Because we were having a little discussion in the chat about who got the the popular vote, who got the electoral vote, and kind of spell out some of the elections where you see the flip-flopping of this and what has happened in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are 5 presidential elections where we have a winner of the popular vote not become president. So in 1824, it's John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson gets the most popular votes, but John Quincy Adams ends up becoming president. The election ends up going to the House of Representatives because no one gets a majority of the votes in the Electoral College, so John Quincy Adams wins. In 1876 is Rutherford B. Hayes versus Tilden. Tilden wins the popular vote, but ultimately Rutherford B. Hayes ends up winning in the Electoral College. It ends up being a really contested election, and there are a bunch of compromises, but it eventually leads in Rutherford B. Hayes winning in the Electoral College. 1888 pits Benjamin Harrison against Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland wins the popular vote, but Benjamin Harrison wins in the Electoral College. In 2000, we have George W. Bush against Al Gore. Al Gore wins the popular vote, but George W. Bush becomes president. And then in 2016, we have Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, where Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote nationally and Donald Trump wins in the Electoral College. This is all just a reminder that, the system does permit in certain circumstances for someone to win the national popular vote, but ultimately the person who wins in the Electoral College ends up becoming president in 1876, 1888, 2000, 2016. And in 1824, it's that one example where there's no majority in the Electoral College, but John Quincy Adams ends up becoming president because of the vote in the House of Representatives.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to go back to kind of the original kind of description around the Electoral College and thinking about who they want it to be as a part of that representative. And this is where the hall classroom question comes into play. So let me read the question on this front, and we're wrapping up everyone now, but we will take 1 second on faithless electors in 1 second because somebody asked that question. So the hall class said, the idea of having electors because the people weren't up to the task could have had more merit in the 1700s and 1800s, but with today's world and the access to information, does the spirit of the Electoral College still make sense on that avenue?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that you're right. The information environment at the founding is so different than the one today. I mean, again, if we're looking at the founding context, you can understand why someone like George Mason would say the people are smart. They should have a say, but frankly, they just won't know who these candidates are because they don't leave their towns. They rarely leave their towns, certainly don't leave their states, and they don't know who these different candidates are going to be. And newspapers are still in their infancy. So if you're in a big city, maybe you'd have a newspaper, but in a lot of other places, you just wouldn't have access to national news. So insofar as if you were a delegate at the founding who was like George Mason, who thought it was a function of a lack of information more than anything why we need an electoral college, then you're right. The information environment today is so different that that premise wouldn't really hold anymore. I think that's sort of a fair conclusion.
Awesome. Next question, and we have so many election questions right now. Real quickly, we'll pop through them. Tell us a little about the faithless electors case. So what is to say that somebody in that Electoral College, and we'll look at that graphic again with the people in the middle, they're handed the votes from the people. This is the general public who are voting. Then here's the electors. So what if this person right here says, you know what, I'm not gonna vote for who I'm told to vote for. I'm gonna vote for who I think is right. Was that originally a thought in the founding fathers that they would be able to have that power to make a switch decision and be like of the caliber of making choices for the people because they were more informed? And what is there to say today with these cases that they have to follow what they're being told? So tell us a little bit more about faithless electors.
So if we were to go back to the convention, there are a few different justifications for the Electoral College and a few different principles written in there. And with faithless electors, we could see them in conflict in certain ways. So certainly one of the key features of the original Constitution is that states are going to have a great deal of say over who the electors are going to be and how they're going to be selected. And so even beginning in the first election of George Washington, you already saw some states having electors selected by popular vote. So you already saw sort of an injection of popular input into the presidential process even that early. At the same time, you certainly had delegates, say like Alexander Hamilton, who thought that a key feature of the Electoral College was that it's an additional check that we can have in place where if we think that the people themselves are somehow going to be fooled by bad politicians, that we can then have a bunch of elites check that. Now, Hamilton, there were people who disagreed with Hamilton on that point, even at the convention. But certainly there were some delegates who thought the Electoral College was precisely there to be an elite check on the popular voice. What we see over time is the Supreme Court has largely upheld different efforts by the states to place limits on elector discretion. So in the late 1800s, we saw a case called McPherson versus BLAIR, which basically just said Michigan was setting up a new system, a lot like the one in Maine and Nebraska we talked about earlier, distributing electoral votes by congressional district. And effectively what the court said is, read the Constitution. Article 2 leaves these decisions to the states. States have broad authority to decide how electors are going to be selected. Then we see another case in 1952, Ray versus BLAIR, where the Supreme Court looks at Alabama's system, which requires electors to pledge ahead of time who they're going to support. So it's a check on the discretion of the electors. And the court said in a 5-2 vote, that's fine. Again, read the Constitution. States have a lot of power. Read McPherson versus BLAIR. We, the Supreme Court, say the states have a lot of power. Of course, consistent with this, electors then can have their discretion curbed, and states can require them to pledge their support for a particular candidate. Finally, just last year, we had a couple of cases dealing with faithless electors, Schiaffolo versus State of Washington and Colorado versus Department of State. It asks the key follow-up question, which is fine. We've already said states can force electors to pledge support for a candidate. Can states actually punish electors if they decide to break their pledge? What sort of punishment? Well, in one state, they fined the electors $1,000 each for voting for someone other than who they said. And in the other state, they just simply threw out that electoral vote and allowed an alternate to come in place. And the Supreme Court had to ask the question, is this okay? And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision written by Justice Elena Kagan, said yes. We see a consistent practice over time, especially from the 12th Amendment onward, where states have used their discretion to create sort of as direct a connection as possible between the people's votes and who becomes president. And states have a great deal of authority to curb elector discretion and ensure that the popular vote is translated into who becomes president. That's what we said. That's what we said in Ray versus Blair, and we're going to say it again here in Schiaffolo, saying that states can actually punish electors if they vote for someone other than they say they're going to vote for ahead of time.
It was a pretty big fine too, if I remember correctly. It was a substantial fine for people. So we're going to wrap up class, and there might be a couple questions afterwards, Tom. But really quickly, when we go back to that original question, we have a system that it's for president called the Electoral College. It's pretty complicated, and the question that comes up every single time we have a presidential election is, should we keep the Electoral College? You know, with all the questions that we've heard peppered through this class today, all the ways that the states have power to change the way that they utilize the Electoral College and get their votes in. Could you lay out kind of both sides of the debate right now and where people are trying to discuss the pros and cons of the Electoral College?
Sure. So for those who support the Electoral College, part of the key argument goes back to the same one that some of the founders were making when they put the Electoral College in place. The Electoral College for supporters is often seen as they value it for preserving a role for federalism in our presidential elections. It allows different states to pursue different ways of choosing electors for the president of the United States. It also works to guarantee that presidents secure nationwide support from a variety of states and variety of types of voters. That's what the supporters say. The critics of the Electoral College counter that, one, you know, if we're looking at a key part of the American constitutional story, it's sort of a story of increased popular input over time, increased democracy, and the Electoral College sometimes can run counter to that, where we can have someone win the national popular vote, but not actually become president of the United States. And the other one is that there's a danger in the Electoral College that only certain states really see the presidential elections and really have the campaigns there. It's really only those swing states, those states that are genuinely competitive, and other states where, you know, it's either a solid Republican state or a solid Democratic state, they just don't see as much of the presidential election, and therefore it dampens political activity in those states. But those are the two sides. In the end, what we have to remember is that the founders put in place in the Constitution a system for amending it with Article 5. And so in the end, we can continue to have these debates in politics, hopefully informed by the Constitution's text, history, the Supreme Court cases we talked about today, but ultimately the final say comes back to the American people through Article 5 and the amendment process there. And also, because of the system of federalism, decisions made by state legislatures on how to select electors.
Awesome. So there's a lot in today's class. We thought last year when we just did the Electoral College, it was a long class. But this year was even more because there's elections every year and there's different types of elections. And that really kind of spelled out what is in the Constitution, how federalism works, and how electing your representatives work. So what's really, really important is to learn about how the systems work, but also make sure that you're an informed person and you find out who's running, what they're running on, and what you deem is right for your voice in that part of the government, in that part of your school board to your presidency. So Tom, thank you so much for walking us through all the Constitution on the side of elections, on the side of voting rights, and even the local elections and talking about federalism. It's a lot to go through and you did an awesome job. So thank you so much. And students, awesome questions today. You really knocked it out of the park and kept us on our toes.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was great.